Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political origins and evolving institutions. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this continuing conversation. Here he is now, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome to a new week of broadcasting here at the Virtual Center. We are today, Monday. Today is the 9th day of November in the year 2015. It is a pleasure to be with you on this really here in Appalachia, Southern Appalachia. Actually, I guess this isn't Southern Appalachia. This is kind of Middle Appalachia, Southern West Virginia.
Central.
Central. Okay. It is cold and damp, and we were just chatting before we went on the air that maybe we've seen the end of what many people refer to as Indian summer, because but it was delightful. While it lasted, it was delightful. We're in a situation today where we'll be lucky if we get out of the 40s. It's raining, it's drizzly, it's damp, it's a little bit windy, and it's just not one of those days that gives you a sense of feeling good. However, with the start of our program today, I do feel good, and I think I have the program to thank for that, and I have the people who support it to thank for the whole thing, including Bob Kincaid and the folks at the Hit On Radio Network. It's a pleasure to be with you on this, the first day of a new week. I invite you to participate actively in our program. I want to begin today's program with a little bit about this. But we do have a phone number, and it's there for your benefit. It gives us the opportunity to give you the opportunity to be on the air and share your thoughts and your ideas, not only with me, but with other folks who are listening. And, of course, we recognize that many of the folks who listen to the program do not do so live, as it were, but pick it up in a later broadcast. And I think what that means is that your ideas and your thoughts will probably be percolating amongst the folks who tune into our programs for several days after you express them. So I think this is a tremendous opportunity for you. Our phone numbers is area code 304-640-6495. 304-640-6495. If you'd like to direct your comments to me via email, I would love to hear from you. And, if they appear to be comments that our general audience could benefit from, I will reserve the right to share them. I will not in any way identify you or try to embarrass you. I will try to give you credit if that's okay. But I would love to hear from you. I'd love to hear your ideas and your thoughts on some of these issues, because very, very honestly, these are, I think, very important, very significant issues. Part of my job here at the Virtual Center is to try to make the case that indeed they are significant, they are important, and they are worth not only our time and attention, but our reflection and analysis, and well worth the conversation about them that we try to get going here at the Virtual Center. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's W-A-O'Brien, O-B-R-I-E-N, 906, all one word, @gmail.com. And I remind you again of our Facebook page. If you go to Facebook and you type in the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution, you will gain access to our Facebook page. And over the last week to 10 days, I've put a number of things on it. I've taken to reacting to some of the news of the day and putting my reactions on Facebook to a certain degree. And part of that is my effort to try to present a little bit more, a little bit less in terms of length and substance, putting it on a little bit more often, if that makes sense. We talked about this before. I say that, and then I'm going to go and contradict myself, because yesterday I posted a piece that was published in yesterday's Charleston Gazette here in West Virginia on higher education, and I think it will become part of our program today as well. When it appeared in yesterday's Charleston Gazette, I took the liberty of copying it and pasting it into as a post on our Virtual Center Facebook page. I'd like it to read it. It is there. I think we will be touching upon some of the, at least the substance of that particular piece in today's program. I mentioned at the very beginning, before I gave the phone number, about how important it was to encourage people to share their thoughts and their ideas. If you were with us on Friday, not Friday, I was thinking it was our final day of broadcast, but that was Wednesday last week, 5 days ago. You know that we were blessed on our last program on Wednesday with two callers. We heard from John during our first hour, and then in our second hour we heard from Horst. The topics were not the same at all, but the ideas and the implications and the depth and the insights of the conversation that ensued really propelled me for quite some degree through the weekend, to be very honest with you. I spent the weekend doing some things, which I'll share with you as part of today's program, in large part because of what occurred in our phone conversations last Wednesday here at the Virtual Center. And more specifically, I'm speaking of John's call during our first hour. I know that I made this point at the end of the call on last Wednesday's program. But I really, the more I've thought about it over the last 3 or 4 days, the more I thought that this particular issue warrants a little bit more attention, a little bit more focus than I was able to give it on last Wednesday's program. If there was ever any doubt that we can learn, that we grow intellectually from sharing our ideas and our thoughts with other people, and that it's the exchange or the conversation about the issues that we focus upon that really produces what I call, what many people in the area of education refer to as new knowledge. It was revealed last Wednesday in our first call with John. You may remember that the topic here at that particular time was Hamilton's program. We had spent a couple of days in last week's first 2 days of programming last week on Hamilton's financial program. And you'll recall that we went through each of the 5 portions of the program: funding and assumption, funding of national debt, assumption of the state debts. Then we look at the creation of the United States Bank. We looked at the issue of promoting manufacturing with a high protective, with a presumably high protective tariff. And then finally we looked at the issue of the excise tax, the tax on the average citizen on certain items, certain goods. And of course the one that gets all the attention is whiskey, because of the whiskey rebellion that occurred in response to the excise tax in 1793. And I believe that I made mention of the fact, I would tell you that there's quite a bit of literature and quite a bit of research done on the so-called whiskey rebellion of 1793 in Pennsylvania. The point that I made was that with President Washington's support, Alexander Hamilton headed a military force of thousands of militia into western Pennsylvania to crush what is called the Whiskey Rebellion, when in fact there really wasn't a rebellion if you think of it in the classic sense. and consequently the media had a field day poking fun at Hamilton and his militaristic inclinations, if you will. I think, and I don't know if I mentioned this or not, but Abigail Adams, in one of her more poignant letters in her exchanges with John, made the point at the time that John, who was vice president then under Washington in the early 90s, that her husband John should be very aware and very careful of Hamilton, because she felt that, and others that she spoke with agreed, that Hamilton had tendencies. He considered himself to be very, very similar in many ways to Julius Caesar. He had this very militaristic image, need for visibility and need for power. It wasn't money, because it's very obvious that his financial program made it possible for a lot of people to do very well financially. Hamilton himself did not. He didn't benefit financially from his own program. I think what drove him were much more ego-driven types, the issues of visibility and power and influence and those kinds of things. And they frightened Abigail, and she warned her husband about them. So we talked a little bit about that when we completed the looking at Hamilton's program. Back to John's call on Wednesday. John made specific reference to Hamilton's program, and he was talking about that. And what we specifically talked about in the conversation we had on the air was the issue of Hamilton's program as a package, as an economic system, if you will. And more specifically, what we talked about was the sociological side, if you will, and I'm using that term advisedly because this is the area, sociology and psychology. These are the areas of the social sciences that seem particularly to pertain to the issue, the concept of system. The whole idea of a system is that it is all-encompassing. The idea is that it functions, its parts function interdependently. And what we end up with is a functioning system which is comprised of individual parts that are internally dependent on the other parts. And the result is that the system itself, in toto, becomes much more important than the parts which make it up. And while scholars, intellectuals, researchers will sometimes break down a system into its component parts in order to study it in more depth, we call it dissecting. They will dissect the whole into its constituent parts and then look at and analyze and research the specific parts. The idea being that this gives more insight into the nature of the overall system itself. The problem with dissecting or looking at the individual parts, the danger of that, of course, is that we become so focused on the parts that we lose sight of the totality of the whole, of the system itself. It's the old idea of the forest and the trees. It's very important to realize and never really forget that a forest is comprised of a series of individual trees. But when you put so much attention on the trees themselves, sometimes you forget. You forget to remember that they are all part of something bigger, which is the forest. And it seems to me that was the issue that John and I were engaged in about Hamilton's program. That indeed it was a system. And if there was ever any doubt that Hamilton considered it as such, that doubt would be dispelled when we look at Hamilton's reaction to Congress's initial defeat of the Assumption Bill. Because of the opposition of Southern states to the proposal for assumption of state debts, primarily because most of the Southern states had already paid their Revolutionary War debts, and it was the Middle and the Middle and New England states that had not. Many of the Southern delegates felt that it was to the best interest of their constituents to not be saddled with the responsibility of helping New England pay off its debts when these taxpayers in Southern states had already made it a point to pay off their own, the debts of their own states. So the Assumption Bill initially suffered defeat. And we talked about the fact that this really concerned Hamilton. And he approached Jefferson on it. And in that exchange, Hamilton clearly made it a point that Jefferson would realize that his program was just that. It was a program. It wasn't a series of isolated proposals, standalone proposals. And therefore, it wasn't enough that some would pass and some might not. Hamilton's argument was that this whole system, this whole program, will sink or swim, depending on whether, in fact, the whole entire package is enacted. And so, therefore, he was very disturbed and looking for ways to reconsider the negative vote on the Assumption Bill. And out of that exchange came Jefferson's decision to invite delegates from Virginia and Maryland to a dinner party at his home, to which he invited Hamilton. And at that dinner party, from all reports, Hamilton issued what we call a quid pro quo, a deal, a proposed deal, that in exchange for the shifting, the changing of certain negative votes on assumption, if he could get the Assumption Bill passed by getting a few of these Southern delegates to change their votes, he would use his influence with Northern congressmen to deliver the national capital to the Potomac River. In other words, the South would get the national capital in exchange for assumption. And a lot of this I preface by saying alleged, because Jefferson goes to great lengths later in his life to deny the quid pro quo nature of this whole episode. More specifically, Jefferson goes to great lengths to make the point that he was not part of any quid pro quo at all. I just provided the opportunity for it to happen, but it wasn't my idea. It wasn't my proposal. In other words, I brought these people together. What they did when they came together is their business. It's not up to me. So Jefferson kind of tried to wash his hands on the whole thing because it made it look very, very political and very, very suspicious. And Jefferson wasn't having any of that. But the mere fact that Hamilton was willing to do that in order to rescue assumption from defeat into victory is an indication of how important he believed not only that his assumption was, but more important, how important assumption was to the total economic program or package of recommendations that he was putting together. And that's the point that John and I were focusing on in our conversation. And out of that conversation came some discussion of the issue of fairness. John raised the issue, I think advisedly so, rightly so, that there are serious questions about whether in fact capitalism itself is fair, in the sense that most people believe that capitalism is tilted to the advantage of certain people at the expense of other people, namely investors, financiers. But the nature of Hamilton's system is to promote it as fair. In other words, if a system is going to work, if individuals are going to stay within the system and abide by it and support it and continue to work within it, it's because they have to believe that the system is basically fair. It may not be fair, but people have to believe it is. And what that means is that in Hamilton's system, the revenue which drove the system came from the excise taxes, from the taxes that citizens paid to the new government. Government then used that revenue to create and fund the program which made speculation opportunities available to the few. Obviously, the speculation opportunities were available to everybody, but only the people with money who could lay their hands on cash could take advantage of the speculation. And so therefore, a few were benefiting financially. The masses were paying for it. That, said Rexford Tugwell, when Rexford Tugwell co-authored an article in 1938 entitled Alexander Hamilton Nation Maker, his whole point was that the totality of Hamilton's program, this system that he created, was responsible for putting the new nation financially, fiscally, on its feet. And Tugwell made the point that the system was internally interdependent. The taxpayers generated the revenue which government could use to make lucrative speculative opportunities available to the few. And the result of that was that the loyalty of the few to the new system was guaranteed, was cemented by those financial opportunities made available. That was what Hamilton called the engine of government that he saw as the driving force of his economic program. John made the point that when you look at it that way, it was an example of what we hear so much today about, namely, the redistribution of revenue. But what we hear today is criticism from corporations, criticism from the few, from the wealthy, that the redistribution of wealth from those who have it to those who don't is a negative. It is a criticism of liberal government. It's a criticism of the Obama administration. It's a criticism of the bailouts. In other words, to try to maintain the vitality of your society by redistributing wealth from those who have it to those who don't is penalizing hard work and success. It's penalizing ability. It's penalizing the job creators, the very people who make the system go, redistribution of wealth seems to hurt directly. So the wealthy have a real issue in today's world with the thought of the redistribution of wealth. To them, that's a violation of their individual freedom. It's a violation of their property rights, of their rights under the Bill of Rights, under the First Amendment, under the Fifth Amendment, because they are being denied property and denied due process in their money is just being taken from them for the purposes of redistributing it to other people who need it. They believe that this is a violation of what America is all about. This is a violation of their freedom. It's penalizing them for their success, talent, and hard work. And from their position, it destroys capitalism. It is indeed socialism, they argue. The point that John made in his call was, in fact, from the very beginning, Hamilton's program called for a redistribution of wealth from the bottom to the top. That, I have to admit, I did at the time, and I have to admit once again today. That was an approach or an idea or an insight that in the many years that I've been dealing with Hamilton's program and teaching it in classes, it never occurred to me that Hamilton's program consisted of the redistribution of wealth from bottom to top. And what we did in the conversation that followed was talk about the nature of system as being the constant movement of capital. What makes capitalism work as an economic system is the flow of capital, the flow of revenue, back and forth, up and down throughout the system. Basically, capitalism theoretically finds its way to those areas of the system which need it at a particular point in time. And it's the redistribution, the constant redistribution of wealth, whether it goes from bottom to top, from top to bottom, that's what makes the system work. And one of the things that we talked about was the issue of fairness in capitalism. As long as the system is working, as long as the system is functioning as a system, then it's possible to make a case for fairness. Because if there is inherent unfairness within capitalism, it never gets the chance to show itself so long as the system continues to function. In other words, it's the functioning flow of capital, flow of revenue, that drives capitalism. And as long as that revenue is flowing to the places it's most needed in order to maintain the system and strengthen it in those areas where it needs to be strengthened, then whether in fact there is an unfairness inherent in it or not, never gets the chance to show. It's when the system stops working. It's when you begin to take the system apart and begin to analyze its various parts that any unfairness that exists within it becomes evident. And I can remember, as part of our conversation on last Wednesday, coming up with the example of musical chairs, the game of musical chairs, which all of us played as children, we know that in the game of musical chairs, there were a set of chairs put together back against back, and music would play, and the children would parade around in a circle around the chairs. And when the music stopped, everybody would grab a chair. It's only then that the unfairness of the system became obvious, because the reality is that there's one less chair than there are children. There's always more children than there are chairs. But as long as the music is playing, and as long as the children are parading around the chairs in a circle, the unfairness of the game is not visible. It only becomes visible when the music stops. And then, as we know in the game of musical chairs, usually what happens is when the music stops, the child with no chair is dismissed from the game. But then something important happens. Before the music resumes, one additional chair is taken from the group, which means that the same unfairness which existed before the music stopped is guaranteed to happen the next time the music stops. My point to John was that as long as the music continues, unfairness within the system is not evident, is not visible. As long, in transferring that analogy to Hamilton's program, as long as capital is flowing, as long as the economy is functioning, as long as growth is happening, as long as jobs are being created, as long as citizens are able to move freely back and forth and find employment, as long as the process remains a process, then any unfairness inherent in capitalism remains merely a matter of debate and political discussion. You can't find it. It's when the economy gets in trouble and slows down or stops. It's when growth isn't happening. It's when some sort of fine-tuning or adjustment becomes necessary in order to try to find the ways to stimulate the flow of revenue, the flow of capital, that inherent unfairness seems to surface and become more visible. What we are seeing today in today's world is an unprecedented increase in the unequal distribution of wealth, to the point that more and more people are finding that for them the music has stopped. And when they go to sit down, they find out that there isn't a chair for them. So the irony of the situation here is that those people who are screaming the loudest about the dangers of redistributing wealth are revealing that they are the ones who are reaping the majority of the benefits from the system as it functions. And they believe that if government takes it upon itself to redistribute wealth in order to keep the system functioning, in order to keep the music playing, as it were, these people are arguing that this is socialism. This is not capitalism. This is not free enterprise. But the fact of the matter is, as Hamilton set the system up, that is exactly what it is. It is an economic system which absolutely requires not only the presence of government, but a priority role for government. Because government has very, very specific parts to play in this whole process. It's not only government's job to make the decisions on the movement of wealth, making sure that revenue goes to the places it's most needed. It's government's job to sell the idea to the masses that the system is fair. And the only way that government can do that, the only way that government can claim fairness, is if the system is functioning, revenue is flowing, jobs are being created, and citizens are being able to find a chair. That means government's job is to make sure that the music never stops. But the irony of the situation, it's running into opposition from the very people who are deriving the most benefit from that system. Call it what you will. Excessive greed, stupidity, naivete, uncontrolled runaway self-interest. I don't know what you'd call it. But it's wrong and it's stupid. And if you go back through the history of this nation, you begin to find clear evidences of prominent people in this system who recognize that, who are more than willing to acknowledge that the only way we can continue to reap the bulk of the benefits from this system is to make sure that the system keeps functioning, that the music keeps playing. Because if it stops, too many people are going to realize that there ain't enough chairs. That conversation that I had on the air with John last Wednesday was one of the most insightful, I think significant conversations on Hamilton's program that I ever had. Obviously, I want to thank John for making that call and engaging in that conversation. But the reason I mention it today is not just to review last Wednesday's program. It is to make the point that this phone number that I try to remember to give out at the front end of each hour that we're on the air is so important, because new knowledge, real learning, can only happen when there's conversation, deliberation, exchange, analysis. When we take our ideas and we're willing to throw them out there, expose them, if you will, to the criticism of others, whose principal goal is not to attack us, but to respond creatively to the ideas that we put out there. And if this works as we hope it will work, as education demands that it work, then the result is going to be intellectual growth for everybody. Everybody will learn. Everybody will come away from the conversation knowing more than they did when they went in. It says a lot about what education is about. It says an awful lot about what's necessary for true education to really happen. It's knowledge and insight that would never happen were it not for the conversation itself. That's why it's so important for folks to avail themselves of access to that phone number and be willing to put their ideas out for discussion. I think it's a learning opportunity for all of us. That's why I believe that the programming, not just the virtual center, but the programming featured on the Head On Radio Network is programming that's not that common out there. It's opportunity for real learning, for real education to happen on the internet. I think it's the kind of technological breakthrough in educational possibilities that will continue to grow as the years go on in our society. That's why I believe it's so absolutely vital that this kind of programming remain out there. Most of us, and it's understandable because I'm the same way, most of us tend to look at this as from the perspective of politics, the difference between liberals and conservatives and all the rest of it. The reality is that the real substantive differences that make up the programs and the recommendations of thoughtful, serious, well-intentioned people have value. And their value can only be realized when other people have the opportunity to respond to those ideas. And that's the benefit, it seems to me, of conversation, of dialogue. That, I would argue, at the bottom line, is what Madison's recommendations toward the end of Federalist Number 10 about refining and enlarging the public views is all about. He's talking about directing the attention of the nation's representatives, elected representatives, toward national issues that need national attention and discussion. He's talking about the fact that that discussion, that negotiation, that deliberation should happen amongst people who have the best interests of the entire nation at heart. In other words, their priority is the public interest, the common interest, not their own. And the civic education that process gives citizens, teaches citizens which candidates will be the best at promoting and perpetuating that process. It's an education and a learning process that is designed to bring the nation's best minds to bear on the major issues and the major problems confronting the nation. I believe that's what Jefferson is all about. What Madison was all about. I believe that's what the recommendations in Federalist Number 10 were all about. And I believe part of the reasons that so few have been able to deduce them is because we are all programmed by those whose self-interest, whose vested interest and power is focused on directing our attention to those aspects of the Federalist Papers, to those aspects of Federalist Number 10, which reinforce their own selfish agenda, their own set of priorities. And they've been so successful at doing it for so long that too many of us have been inclined to totally overlook the other ideas and the other insights and the other possibilities that Madison has written into his Federalist Number 10 and some of the other Federalist Papers that make it up. Many people have debated the differences between Hamilton and Madison. Some people have pointed out the similarities between them in terms of their attitudes towards government and the rest of it, as revealed in the Federalist Papers. One of the things that I've come to conclude, I believe, as we've been doing these programs here at the Virtual Center for better than 2 years now, is that what I see as a major difference between Hamilton and Madison, by comparing the Federalist Papers, I believe that the political agenda associated with Hamilton's arguments is much more prominent and much stronger. I think with Madison, there's a depth, there's a sense of something bigger than politics and political agendas. I believe he makes reference to it in a number of Federalist Papers. When he says, yes, there's this, yes, there's self-interest, but there's also something else. Yes, there's no doubt you can find self-interest in human nature. But on the other hand, there are these other characteristics of human nature, and these are the ones that are going to determine whether popular government, whether Republican government in this society has a chance to make it or not. I think that's a perspective, or that's a facet or a phase, if you will, of the Federalist Papers that is exclusive to Madison. I don't think Hamilton and John Jay fit into that at all. I think they fit into the economic political side, as does Madison. But Madison never loses sight of this other dimension, this deeper dimension, this bigger dimension. And I think over time, as we've done these programs here at the Virtual Center, we've been able to unearth, to surface aspects of that dimension, which I don't hear happening anywhere else. And I think a lot of it is due to the depth of the conversation that we've been able to generate here at the Virtual Center. I think Bob Kincaid himself has had a large role to play in that conversation. Over the months, we don't get that many calls, but the ones we get are astounding. And I think we had an example of that last Wednesday, and I didn't want the opportunity to pass us by without calling attention to it and thanking John and thanking Horst for their willingness to get on the air and share their thinking and their ideas. How many times, when Horst has called, have we heard him say, I really don't have anything worked out in my mind. These are just ideas floating around. I don't know how they connect. But they intrigue me and they disturb me, or they excite me, or whatever. And he throws the ideas out there, and it gives us a chance, all of us, to digest them and to assess them and to reflect upon them and think about them. And I think the result is that all of us grow intellectually because of the opportunity that he's given us. That's quite an amount of time devoted to a phone number. But I really believe that's really what the availability of that phone line is all about. I know it's difficult. And I know some people are a little bit intimidated about it because they say, well, these things are just floating around in my mind. I don't want to basically lay them out there and open myself up and expose myself to criticism and all of that. So it's obvious that given the nature of the animal, so to speak, given what we're talking about, a lot of people probably are reluctant or never quite ready to do that. And I appreciate that. I understand that. But the reason I keep pushing it and the reason I keep promoting that phone number is because, as we learned last Wednesday, when people do overcome their reticence and do avail themselves of the opportunity to call in, it usually turns out to become a benefit to everybody. And therefore, I want to do everything that I can do to solicit it. Not to demand it from everybody, because I don't think that's fair. But to remind everybody that the opportunity is there, and it's a very, very tremendously important one. And I just want people to know and be comfortable when the inclination hits them to be willing to do it. And I think that's really what it's all about. I mentioned, and I'm kind of off that particular topic, and we've taken pretty much 45 to 50 minutes on that topic, but I think it's that significant. Let me share with you something. I mentioned this at the very beginning, that I've been over and over this stuff. I've been working this stuff in my mind now for 3 or 4 days. I've been trying to do some writing. I've been trying to get these ideas down, these principles down and on paper, because I don't want them to get lost. I don't want them lost. I've been checking and doing some research. I've been going back over materials that I've read before because I've seen so many references to this kind of stuff. This idea of system and the nature of system, that I felt it very worthwhile to do everything that I can do to work it through. Let me share with you one of the sources, one of the resources that I've come across over the last few days related to this. This is an excerpt, and I know you're not going to believe this. This is an excerpt from Adam Smith. Most of us, the Adam Smith that most of us know, is the author of Wealth of Nations, the so-called Bible of free enterprise capitalism. But on more than one occasion, we've mentioned here at the Virtual Center that Adam Smith is responsible for other important writings, one of which is his essay on moral sentiments, in which he delves into the origins of morality within human nature, from the perspective of those who consider Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations to be the Bible of free enterprise capitalism. Many of the things that Adam Smith says in his essay on moral sentiments become blatantly contradictory. They don't make any sense. So it seems to me we either have to find a way to separate Adam Smith from his essay on moral sentiments, or we have to rethink his Wealth of Nations and begin to realize that there's much more to Adam Smith's views of commercial capitalism in the 18th century than we've been led to believe. What about this issue of moral sentiments? More specifically, what about this issue of economic system? Adam Smith, in his essay on moral sentiments, has a section in there in which he's discussing governments, institutions, and programs. The kinds of programs created by government for purposes of governing, of maintaining a society that is governable. And this is what Adam Smith says about systems, specifically about governments, creations, programs, policies, and institutions designed to improve the standard of living for people. In talking about these programs, Adam Smith says, they make part of the great system of government, and the wheels of the political machine seem to move with more harmony and ease by means of them. These social programs, these social policies, Social Security, unemployment, health care, all of these things that we fool around with today, become part of the political machine that make the wheels of that machine move in harmony. They make us able to live together as a society. Adam Smith goes on, if you would implant public virtue in the breast of him who seems heedless of the interests of his country, in other words, if you were to spend time trying to implant or embed public virtue into a person who cares nothing about the country he lives in, the interest of his country, Smith says it will often be to no purpose to tell him what superior advantages the subjects of a well-governed nation enjoy, that they are better lodged, that they are better clothed, that they are better fed. These considerations will commonly make no great impression on some people. You will be more likely to persuade in the direction of public virtue if you describe the great system of public police, and I ask you to note the use of the word police here, which procures these advantages. If you explain the connections and the dependencies of its several parts, their mutual subordination to one another, and their general subserviency to the happiness of the society at large. If you show how this system might be introduced into his own country, what it is that hinders it from taking place there at present, how those obstructions might be removed, and all the several wheels of the machine of government be made to move with more harmony and smoothness, without grating upon one another or mutually retarding one another's motions. In other words, if you want to build civic virtue, public virtue in your population, in your citizens, you can talk about the fact that you have more, that you're better fed, you're better clothed, you eat better than anybody. You can do that until you're blue in the face. Smith is saying it ain't going to sink in. It's not going to work. But if you begin to make the case that it's the social policies and institutions created within a society that makes possible the better functioning of that society, so that we begin to work together in harmony, so that the machine of government runs more smoothly, then citizens can begin to really appreciate the benefits of the system or the government or the country that they live in. Then they're much more willing to subscribe to the principles of virtue which make them good citizens. He says, it is scarce possible that a man should listen to a discourse of this kind and not feel himself animated to some degree of public spirit. He will, at least for the moment, feel some desire to remove those obstructions and to put into motion so beautiful and so orderly a machine. What I ask you to think about is that that's what Hamilton's program, his economic system, is about, is the smooth operation and functioning of the economy, of all of its parts, working together, supporting each other, every part working to the benefit of all the other parts. In other words, the music is playing. And as long as the music continues to play, nobody's going to notice that everybody doesn't have a chair. It's not until it's not until the music stops and everybody goes to find a chair that they realize that somebody is not going to be able to sit down. There's not room for everybody. Then is when people begin to focus on the unfairness of the system. That's why Hamilton wanted assumption. That's why he was willing to negotiate the location of the national capital to get it. That's why this particular aspect of Washington's first administration is so important. Inherent within Hamilton's program is the basic unfairness of capitalism. It's built in there. It's visible in the speculation opportunities made available to some. It's in there in the benefits of high protective tariffs for manufacturers, for manufacturing areas of the country. It's there for those who will benefit directly from the operation of a United States bank. And all of it requires funding. It requires money. And the key is that the money comes from the masses, from the population at large. That's our contribution to the symphony which drives this economic system. And for certain people who are deriving the most from it, to complain about the redistribution of wealth as being a violation of capitalism, that is the most self-interested, uninformed point of view that you could possibly have. But in fact, what has happened as this nation reels under reactions to an economy which seems to be out of whack because of the inequality that it is creating. Those at the top, if you will, those reaping the most benefit, have begun to take revenue out of the system rather than reinvesting it back into the system. And they're stashing it in overseas accounts and in luxury purchases of luxury goods. But the reality is that the most productive economy in the history of the world of man, the economy that is generating more wealth than any other economy in history, is not producing jobs. It's not growing opportunity for the masses of people who live within it. Rather, it's flowing to the few at the top. In effect, what they are doing is deciding that for them, they do best when the music stops and they can take away a chair. And what they are doing is extracting revenue from the very economy that is producing it. In the process, they are making this economic system dysfunctional. And those who suffer the most from that are indeed suffering the most. And I think in our second hour today, we'll begin to see how, indeed, that is happening. Let's pause and take our 5-minute break. We've gone a little bit beyond the top of the hour. It's about 7 minutes after. Let's pause and take our 5-minute break, and then we'll return, and we'll get into a little bit of what happens when the music stops and people begin to count chairs. You're listening to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. We're going to take a short 5-minute break. We'll be right back, so please stay with us. Thank you.
We now return to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. Here again is Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome to our second hour, abbreviated though it is because the first one ran too long. Today's edition of the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. It is Monday. It is the 9th day of November in the year 2015. If you are just joining us, I want to thank you. I will say that we spent our first hour pretty much reviewing the implications and the benefits of one of the calls that we received in our last program last Wednesday from John, who called and raised questions about Hamilton's program, and that's really what we spent the first hour on today. What we were talking about basically was the extent to which Hamilton's system is just that, a system, a total system. I'll refer back or return to that theme again very quickly at the start of this particular portion of our program today, because I want to get into some of the details of the kinds of things that can happen when the system begins to not work. Or to use the analogy of the game of musical chairs that we were using, what happens when the music stops? People begin to look for a place to sit, and what they find out is that there aren't enough chairs for everybody. That's the point at which the innate unfairness in the system of capitalism becomes visible. Hamilton's whole idea then is that in order for the internal and innate unfairness of free enterprise capitalism to remain not visible, it's important for the system to function. As long as revenue is moving through it, as long as the economy is functioning, as long as loans are being made and debts are being paid, as long as jobs are being created, Granted, jobs are being eliminated as progress occurs. But in theory, as jobs disappear, new ones, better ones reappear. As long as that process is functioning, then whatever inherent aspects of free enterprise capitalism there are that are not fair remain pretty much invisible. People are too focused upon and too busy doing what best benefits them in a growing economy that they really never get time or the inclination to look for the unfairness. It's those people for whom the system is not working. They are the ones who begin to look at the system, and they are the ones who begin to perceive the inequities within it. That's really the system. That's really the theme that we're looking at. That's the one that we'll continue to pursue here in this second hour. I want to remind you that we do have our phone number available. We would love to hear from you and have you share your thoughts and your ideas and your thinking on some of these things with us. Our phone number is area code 304-640-6495. I was on the verge of giving you my wife's cell phone number. Our number, again, is area code 304-640-6495. My email address, if you'd like to share your thoughts with me directly, is waobrien906@gmail.com. waobrien, OBRIEN, 906@gmail.com. Back to our program, back to our last hour, just for a moment, as kind of a way to lead in to this particular topic. One of the things we saw is that, and again, this is repeat, as long as the system is functioning, as long as the system seems to be working for everybody, then whatever inherent inequities there are within it remain secondary, largely invisible, of no particular moment, provided good things are happening. It's when good things stop happening that people begin to look much more critically at the nature of the system itself. Obviously, the very nature of system suggests that it keep functioning. I mentioned at the outset of our last hour that I've spent a little bit of time based on this, based on our last program, and based on John's call from last Wednesday. I began to do some writing, trying to get some ideas down on paper. I'd like to share briefly, because I'm not at all at the point where I'm ready to put out any of this for reaction, because right now it's just kind of a series of unconnected paragraphs that really don't make a whole heck of a lot of sense when they're read together. But I'm hoping that each paragraph within itself makes some sense. So let me share a few of these with you. In 1938, Rexford Tugwell, key member of Franklin D. Roosevelt's so-called Brain Trust, co-authored an article in Columbia University Quarterly entitled Alexander Hamilton Nation Maker, which sought to establish symmetry between the status assumptions of the New Deal and quite similar but unappreciated qualities in Hamilton's in Alexander Hamilton's economic recommendations to the First Congress in 1790-1791. Tugwell described Hamilton's financial program as, quote, a theoretical plan which is just beginning to be appreciated. This is in 1938. A kind of economic organization, grand and imperial in scope. And this is what I've said about that. The financial scheme Hamilton envisioned encompassed key segments of society bound together in an intricate, interdependent economic system designed to function as just that, a system. Its parts made little sense except within the context of the whole. As an organic, machine-like entity modeled on the ideal community. None of the parts could even exist, let alone operate, without the support of and regular interaction with the other parts, each performing its assigned task for the benefit of the whole. Tugwell explained the details in Hamilton's program as follows. A fully negotiable funded debt, drained originally from the small property classes and met by taxes paid by the masses, was to be used by an emergent money class to create profitable speculative enterprises in land, industry, and finance. That's a quote. That's what the way Tugwell explained the interconnectedness, the interdependency, if you will, within Hamilton's system. This is what the observations I've made about that. That Hamilton was immersed in a world defined by the pursuit of order and symmetry is beyond question. Isaac Newton had revealed an ordered universe. David Rittenhouse successfully recreated that universe in his so-called orrery, a precise model of its operation. Adam Smith, using the clock as his image, commended those able to appreciate the clock's precision and gifted us with the idea of the invisible hand to stabilize an economy modeled upon that precision. Jefferson was captivated by Condorcet's applications of mathematics in his quest for precision in existing constitutions. James Madison's great desideratum of government, this in a letter to Thomas Jefferson in 1787, this great desideratum in government, according to Madison, was so to distribute power among competing factions that deliberation and compromise were its logical end results. By using nature's order as man's optimum benchmark, be it the motion of the planets, rhythm of the seasons, rising and falling of and setting of the moon, or the predictable behavior of God's creatures in adjusting to that world, Hamilton's plan to synchronize complexities in the economy with the political world they would serve was quite consistent with Dr. Samuel Johnson's definition of mechanism in his dictionary: a construction of parts dependent on each other in any complicated fabric, unquote. In other words, the sum total of the interdependence and the connectedness of a series of parts into a functioning, operational entity, whole. Helpful as it is to conceptualize a system, any system, as a functioning dynamic operation, and to focus attention more on the whole than on its parts. It's important to recognize system's total reliance on doing what it was created to do, functioning. A system not functioning is no system at all. We measure the value of human life by what living permits man to accomplish. When life ends, its ability to create value ends. True functionality in Hamilton's grand and imperial scheme was the movement of capital through it. What the economists call cash flow, embellished by the factors needed to drive it: stable interest rates and currency values, available credit, dependable purchasing power, fiscal reliability, predictability. All of these would validate its effectiveness. The most critical variable to an economy's vitality and sustainability is faith, undisputed, unquestioned trust in the system's fairness. Oliver Wolcott, assistant to Hamilton and Hamilton's replacement in Treasury when he left office in 1795, Wolcott explained the extreme political volatility of the program, pinpointing the source of prospective trouble and government's ongoing need to manage the situation effectively. Quote, "The taxes necessary to pay the interest will be burdensome," he remarked, "and they will appear to be just only to those who believe that the good attained is more important than the evil which they are suffering." Clearly, it was up to government to make sure that citizens were constantly reminded of the benefits that their taxes generated, presumably in the expansion of the economy and the creation of jobs that wise investors at the top would make possible. Hamilton made it perfectly clear when the ingredients of his program were debated in Congress that this was indeed a system. To eliminate any of its parts would render the whole inoperable. That was the argument he made to his cabinet colleague, Thomas Jefferson, when a key part of the program, assumption of state debts, was defeated in a purely sectional vote. Most southern states had paid off their debt and were unwilling to ask their citizens to help northern states pay off theirs. Jefferson responded by inviting key southern delegates to a dinner party at his home, where Hamilton proposed one of the most astounding quid pro quo deals in all of American history: his promise of northern support for location of the national capital on the Potomac in exchange for a few positive votes for assumption. Thereby, the central government took on over $25 million in state debts, in addition to the $56 million in national obligations it already owed under the funding bill approved earlier. Thereby, Hamilton was able to generate more than $80 million in speculative opportunities for the nation's financiers. This was the so-called engine of government portion of Hamilton's plan, the way he was able to tie the nation's investors to the new government. The revenue to make payments on this debt to the government's creditors would come from the masses in excise taxes on targeted items like whiskey that citizens were sure to buy, taxed or not. And that's kind of as far as I've gotten. But the one thing, and I just wanted to make a point where I stopped there about the tax on whiskey. One of the things that Hamilton realizes, and I think it's pretty profound given when it is. I mean, this is in 1790. One of the most astounding things that Hamilton realizes is when it comes to taxes, there are certain items that you can tax, and no matter how much you tax them, people will continue to buy them. In other words, the price will go up as the taxes keep increasing price. But there are certain items where the price never gets so high that people begin to say, I'm not going to buy it, I won't pay that. And alcohol's one. Tobacco's another one. What other product can you think of where legislatures would seriously debate raising a tax on a pack of cigarettes by $1? And people will pay it. Part of the reason, of course, is that tobacco is addictive. Part of the reality is that alcohol can be addictive also. But the fact of the matter is, there are certain items that people they'll gripe about it, but they'll continue to buy it and they'll continue to pay it no matter how high the tax is. Hamilton knows that. And he's aware that putting an excise tax on whiskey is a good place to put the taxes. What good would it be to tax items that people could turn around and say, that's too expensive, I'm not going to buy that. But they never do that with alcohol. I mean, I know people that will sacrifice food in order to buy that case of beer on the weekend. And say, I'd love to buy a piece of steak, but I'm going to go without it this week because this week I got to buy the case of beer. Or a quart of whiskey or whatever. I think that's pretty profound on Hamilton's part. But again, the point that I made at the end of the last hour, and the point that I really wanted to use as lead into this one, is the issue of inequity. What happens when there are inherent, innate inequities in a system that people can't really see so long as the system continues to function? But when the inequities become so profound, so pronounced, that they affect the functioning of the system itself, it's then and only then that the inequities become visible and that people become upset and people become determined to fix the system in order to change and make it equitable again. What we are experiencing in today's world, I would suggest, is some of the fallout from the inequities in our system, from the inequality that has become so dramatic and so pronounced, with such a large percentage of profit and wealth is flowing into the hands of fewer and fewer people. And more people are finding out that for them, the music has stopped. And lo, when they look for a chair, for a place to sit, they're finding that there isn't one. They are finding that this game called the economy is really a game of musical chairs. And that for some, there are never enough chairs. Consequently, the system which has to function in order to be system becomes dysfunctional. When that happens, the inequities within it become visible. And when that happens, there's all sorts of fallout in all sorts of different directions. If I may, I'd like to address one. And the reason I'm picking this particular one is it's become so prominent in the news of late. Last week, let me be specific. A week ago Friday, excuse me, I got the wrong document in my hands here. A week ago, on November 2nd, in the major publications around the country, the New York Times, the Washington Post, Politico online, the Atlantic Monthly, Huffington Post, began to publish articles about some research that was done on death rates in America. And one of the results of this study, conducted by two economists at Princeton University, Nobel Prize winner Angus Deaton and his wife, Anne Case, who's also a PhD economist. What they were finding is that despite the fact that throughout the world, the developed world, death rates are declining. People are living longer. In spite of all the disasters, all the national disasters, all the wars and the rest of it. What we know is that basically, because of improvements in nutrition and climate and behavior and all the rest of it, people are living longer. With one major exception. And that is older, middle-aged, white Americans. Generally those between the ages of 45 and 54. The research that they've done is over the last 13 years, from the beginning of the millennium, 2000, up until the present. And what they found was that while the rates of death for every group throughout the developed world are declining, mortality data is improving for everybody except this group of white males in the United States. And that the death rate among that group of older, white, middle-aged males in America, and there's one other variable, poorly educated, those who have gone to high school but maybe didn't graduate, maybe went to college but didn't graduate there either. In other words, these are white, middle-aged Americans who did not graduate from college. Between 1999 and 2014, the death rate of this particular group of Americans increased by 134 deaths per 1,000 people. Other than AIDS, this is the most dramatic reversal in demographic trends in recent memory. And what they point out is that many people have made comments of the fact that there seem to be an awful lot of people dying from drug overdoses, from abuse of prescription drugs, from alcoholism, from suicide. What their research shows is that middle-aged white Americans are dying through drug overdoses, alcoholic abuse, and suicides at a rate which is totally different than what's happening to every other demographic group in the developed world. What the hell is happening? People are killing themselves, drinking themselves to death. Why? Well, these people began to speculate. And what they began to realize were comments in a variety of places were saying this is the first generation where young people are faced with a life, a standard of living that's not going to be the equivalent of the previous one. For certain people, what we call the American way, the American dream, progress, has become a fraud. It ain't there. There aren't any jobs. There aren't any opportunities that seem to suggest that there soon are going to be jobs. Our education system, all the data tells us, is failing. Our kids' test scores are becoming worse. More and more people are finding themselves dependent, homeless, in shelters, eating at food banks, living with their children in automobiles. Families are finding themselves the victim of abuse, spousal abuse and child abuse is increasing at an incredibly fast rate. All of these things.
Hey, Dr. Bill?
Yes, Bob?
May I chime in, please?
Please do.
I feel like I've kind of got a dog in this hunt because I'm at the leading edge of that demographic.
Okay.
So that's my generation we're talking about.
I think I can relate to it as well, Bob. But go ahead.
But those 45 to 54-year-olds, when I first saw this story, I guess it's just the way that my mind works. But I tried to figure, and it dawned on me. You know when that demographic was born.
When's that, Bob?
That's every. We're talking about white males here. That's every white male who was born in the 1960s.
Okay.
It's not the 70s and it's not the 50s.
Mm-hmm.
It's the 60s and all the turbulence and all the upheaval that brought. Mine is a generation that was born into war. You know, we were children. I was a child during Vietnam and up to my early teens. Well, 12 for me when it all ended. We saw the space race, and we saw a ton of promise, and the promises were not fulfilled.
Mm-hmm.
Among other things, another thing that occurs inside this demographic, this is the demographic that conveniently got cheated out of its Social Security. Remember when Ronnie Reagan and Tip O'Neill took their jackets off and rolled their sleeves up, as Chris Matthews is so fond of talking about, and got down to the business of doing the business of government and fixing Social Security? Well, right. That generation that you're talking about there, the white male suicide generation, we're the ones that got fixed. We're the ones that were told, no, everybody else gets to retire at 62 or 65, but not you schmucks. You work till you die,
mm-hmm.
which is what 67, and now they're talking about 70. That's what that feels like. And so, and as people like Paul Ryan continue to talk about, Social Security is going to people are living longer. You know what? With this information, Bill, I don't ever want to hear another Republican say, yes, but people are living longer. Not the ones that got screwed, aren't.
No, that you're right.
And so, they want, it's 67 now, they want 70. What they've effectively told my generation is, look, you're not going to get Social Security, so why don't we just go ahead and eliminate it? They won't, because it's still the third rail. So no Republican's going to say, hey, Granny out there. Yeah, you get cat food from now on.
Yeah.
Because the older Americans would go and they would vote en masse, and the Republican Party would cease to exist.
Right.
But it's okay to do it to my generation. So
because it's been being done to this generation for some time.
Right. I mean, the Social Security fix was done to me when I was, more worried about the hottie at the end of the bar than I was about my retirement.
Bob, let me ask a question, and this kind of leads into a point that I was going to make, but you've created a perfect opportunity to make it. One of the things that this research shows is that this statistic doesn't apply to Hispanic Americans and African Americans.
No.
Only white Americans. And so I think I know the answer, but I'm going to ask the question anyway. Why do you think the racial disparity? Have you thought about that?
Well, I'm going to speak I have thought about it, Bill, and I'm going to speak in fairly frank terms. It is because Hispanics and other people of color have been getting crapped on by this country for so long that they're probably accustomed to it.
So there really was no unfulfilled expectations for them. And so and this is exactly what the data indicates, what the research indicates, is that other groups of color has made accommodation a long time ago for the fact that the so-called American dream didn't apply to them.
Right.
But the demographic we're talking about, whites, were the people who believed probably more firmly than anything in the American dream, in what they were told was true.
Yeah, well, when a teabagger says we're going to take our country back, they mean it. It's a white country that they feel like has been taken away from them. The promises, the dreams, the economy, the purpose. They feel like it has been taken away from them, Bill, but they don't realize it wasn't taken away from them by the people who were already being defrauded. It was taken away from them by the people who figured that, it's time for them. The people that Hamilton was servicing. Okay.
Right. The people that decided to take what they could get now and lost sight of the fact that this was a system that everybody was dependent on in order for everybody to make it. And by making it possible, by taking, I use the analogy of the musical chairs, by taking away the chairs, by taking profit out of the system and stashing it, and then blaming it on government, the results on government. Basically, what you're doing is you're making it more and more obvious for more and more people that the system is not working for them. And they're dying at rates that are incredible. They're killing themselves. It's absolutely unbelievable. And to me,
but Bill,
it's evidence as to how this system needs to work. Hamilton knew it. Damn it, I hate to say that. I mean, I know that he was favoring certain people and all the rest of it.
Yeah, but he knew you had to. But he knew you had to throw the proles a bone once in a while.
Exactly. You had to make, and that's what Roosevelt did in the 1930s. Now I hear when people are accusing Bernie Sanders of being a democratic socialist, that what they say is that what Bernie Sanders is talking about was what FDR did. But FDR didn't come from the same class or the same background that Bernie Sanders has come from. Roosevelt came from the elite, from the established patriarchs of this country. And he knew that the system would fall apart if we didn't do things differently.
And he knew, Bill, what would happen to his class if it did.
If it did, exactly.
So my generation, and I realize education plays a part in it, and I'm more educated than not. So my generation has looked at it and said, well, you know, it really wouldn't be nice if we went and got the torches and the pitchforks and started lining up the 1% against the wall and, you know, taking care of matters that way. That you know, that's just not sporting. That's not cricket.
Right.
So we'll just kill ourselves instead. We'll drink ourselves to death. We'll smoke ourselves to death. We will, we will work ourselves to death too. Mm-hmm. But the thing is, in working ourselves to death, we're not working ourselves to death the way our daddies did.
No.
Because, you know, our daddies
had a target, and they knew that what they were sacrificing, their kids were going to reap the benefit from.
Right, and they reap benefits too. I mean, my dad had a real live, honest to God pension. He didn't have some 401k that bobbed and floated on the ebb and flow of Wall Street. He had a pension. He had a promise from Reynolds Metals Company that when they had used him all they could use him, they would pay him a fixed amount of money per month for the rest of his natural-born days.
Right.
Who's got that anymore?
Yeah, not very few, fewer and fewer all the time.
And who got it taken from them?
And who's being blamed for it? The people themselves are being accused of being dependency, of looking for entitlements, of claiming entitlement to things that they don't have a right to.
Oh, right. And when these right wingers say you just want free stuff, well, yeah. Okay, you know what? I'll be the first one to admit it would be nice for a change, because there hasn't been any free stuff for my generation ever. Mm-hmm. Now, the generation ahead of me, no, and I'm not playing class warfare here with you, Bill.
No, I understand.
Y'all got free stuff.
Yeah. Well, we
don't get any free stuff.
Let me share with you a perspective from the generation ahead, one generation ahead of you, because this has occurred to me today as I was putting this material together as well. I retired 2 years ago. And over that 2 years, I've had a tough time making the financial adjustment from the fact that I'm not getting a paycheck for the first time in 50 some odd years. And one of the things that I did with my wife laughs at me about but she's right. She points this out to me and said, you got to deal with this. One of the things that I did when I began to make a paycheck over the last 15 years, 20 years that I worked, was that my paycheck was bigger than any paycheck I'd ever dreamed about, any paycheck that my dad ever dreamed about. In other words, I was an example of the fact that the sacrifice my parents went through for me finally paid off. Because I got an education, I got a degree, I ended up with a job after bouncing around for many years, a job that was bringing me more money, not a lot of money in today's world, but more money than I'd ever seen at one time. And one of the things that I began to do, Bob, is give it away. One of the things that made me happiest was to sit down and make contributions to things like United Way and the Humanities Council and Hospice and the Cancer Society and the Salvation Army. And at the end of the year, when it came tax time, I would begin to add up for purposes of my income tax return money that I gave to Rotary, to the United Way, to Hospice, to Humanities Council, to public broadcasting, to all of these things that I really supported. And that was, for me, one of the most fulfilling things, is that finally, for the first time in my life, the things that I got the most benefit from, I was able to contribute to. And then I retired 2 years ago. And one of the first things that I had to do was eliminate all of that giving. No longer could I have money taken out of our bank account every month for, automatic deductions for United Way and all the rest of them. And suddenly I had to contact every one of these agencies and say, the $300 or the $30 a month that I was sending you is now going to be $10. or 5 or non-existent. And that's part of the adjustment to retirement that I had to make. I couldn't do the things that mattered the most to me. And I wasn't spending money on myself. I was spending money on other people that I felt needed it, that I could finally do something about.
Mm-hmm.
And now it's gone. And it's been painful. And my wife comments on it all the time because it kills me. Because she kept saying, you're going to have to call this outfit. You're going to have to call this organization and tell them that you can't afford it anymore. There's nothing that you gave as long as you could. You gave for years. And I kept saying, and I used to tell her, and I said, look, if I can't, at this point in my life, if I can't do the things, the little things like that matter to me, then what the hell good is retirement? Why be retired? Might as well be working. At least I could do those things when I worked. And that's part of my adjustment. And so when I look at it in light of the things you said about your generation, it's becoming obvious that depending on which generation you're in, the reactions are different, but they're all negative.
Well, they are, and let's talk for just a minute as we wind out. I've got a friend. I went to high school with him. He and I are political polar opposites in many ways, and he's brilliant. I was a liberal arts guy. He's an engineering guy. Mm-hmm. And this guy is a hard worker. He knows what he's doing. And he goes and he was at a company for 10 years, and then he was at a company for 5 years, and then he was at a company for 50, that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. But he never gets, he only works for a company until the company is done with him. Mm-hmm. And it seems to me that in my father's generation, which is one ahead of you, in my father's generation, there was an implied symbiosis, sometimes an express one, between corporate America and business and the people who made it go. Mm-hmm. No company ever wants to pay a worker more than they have to, but they paid what they had to.
Right.
But now they've figured out, that people are expendable. We're really not, but we are deemed to be.
Right.
And so that contract, which I think I think it's echoed in Hamilton's sentiments. Mm-hmm. That contract has been breached. I think about our good friend Ben Birch, who runs the servers for White Rose Society. He posted on his Facebook page the other day that, well, he's going to have to be looking for work because the corporation that he's given the last decade of his life to has told him that he is no longer necessary. Mm-hmm. Because a speculator named Carl Icahn came in and started bleeding the company of its wealth. Mm-hmm. And that's the thing. I think one of the things that's missing is an understanding. There's lip service given to it, but one of the things that is missing is the understanding that the wealth of a corporation is not in its shares. Mm-hmm. It's in its people.
It's in its people, and we say that all the time. But only now is it becoming clear. Do you remember when one of the issues about when Mitt Romney was running in 2012? One of the issues about his background and about his corporate background was that the company that he founded, and I can't remember the name of it,
Bain Capital. All right, their job was to basically take failing companies and reinvigorate them by eliminating jobs. And by scaling down the costs of labor as much. In other words, the whole issue, the whole approach towards success in our society of late is focused principally on eliminating people. And the Pope, in his encyclical, talked about the threat of technology to making more and more people useless. And I think he's right. And there's always been an element of that in business. But it has never seemed to. But it's never seemed to be quite so stark or quite so cruel.
Right.
I was just thinking about. I was creating a neologism in my mind: the encruelation of American business. Mm. The adding of what would we call it? Monetized cruelty.
Mm-hmm.
And you can't be cruel to people and not expect them to react.
Right. Bob, I think we're going to have to leave. I think
we do. I couldn't resist jumping in on this, though.
That's okay. I'll get back to it tomorrow. We'll get back to it. Thank you all very much for tuning in to today here at the Virtual Center. We have almost no time left. Just time enough to tell you to thank you and tell you to be safe, be good to each other, and we'll see you tomorrow. This is Bill O'Brien. Thank you.